So good morning, everyone. I am Troy Wiggins. And as Whitney said, I'm a writer, I'm an editor. I am a Memphian, and I want to thank all of you for joining us this Saturday morning to talk, hopefully very deeply, about the relationship between art, gentrification, community, and politics. Before we get into the conversation, I would like to thank Whitney again, not only for the introduction, but also for being a tireless advocate for artists in this community and art collectors in this community. Events like this help to expose people to the true power of art. And that's the power of art is something I believe in deeply, even though I'm not a visual artist. So I moonlight as a facilitator, so I'm gonna do a bit of facilitating up here before we get started. We have about 45 minutes to have this conversation. So the panelists and I are gonna talk for about 30 minutes, and then we're gonna turn it over to y'all to ask us some questions for the last 15. So I'm gonna start very briefly by introducing our panelists, and I'm gonna let them talk more about themselves. I'm not gonna do a big, lengthy introduction. So to my right here is Patty Daigle. Patty's the director of the Martha and Robert Fogelman Galleries of Contemporary Art at the University of Memphis. She's also a visiting professor of art history in the Department of Art. To my right is ArJae Thompson, who's of the Norf Art Collective in Nashville, Tennessee. Norf uses public art to bring awareness to social justice issues facing residents in Nashville. So please give a hand to our panelists. So we'll start with letting the panelists tell us more about themselves and their work. So, and I guess we'll start with Patty. So the question for you, both of you, to start out is, who are you, what do you do, and why do you do it?
Thank you, Troy, and thank you for having us both here. It's a pretty deep question of who am I. In terms of what I do, again, as Troy mentioned, I run the Martha and Robert Fogelman Galleries of Contemporary Art at U of M. I began working there in fall 2015. So on the one hand, I feel still kind of new to Memphis. On the other hand, I feel like I've been here for a really long time. And then I'm also a professor of art history. My background, in terms of kind of my academic background, is in American art history, early 20th century. And in terms of sort of my interest in art and politics, obviously I'm interested from a contemporary perspective, but also from a historical one. And in particular, how kind of some of these issues that we're dealing with today really kind of perpetuate themselves and are issues that we've been talking about for centuries in many cases. And that's something that really fascinates me in terms of the way in which sort of visual art, the visual world, can shape perception, whether it's racial or gender or what have you. That's just kind of a very general interest of mine, and I'm sure for many of you as well. And I think what we'll talk about today a little bit more is just the role that art and artists, art organizations play in creating social change, and especially this idea of publicness. What is the public? Who is the public? I think are issues that hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about today. And in terms of why I do what I do, I think at my heart, I love being an educator, whether it's through curatorial work. I actually have a background in museum curation, which was kind of an interesting segue into what I do now, kind of as a one-woman band at the Fogelman Galleries, kind of doing all levels of kind of arts management, but having this kind of curatorial background and being in a more sort of, I wouldn't say elitist, but I think perceived as elitist kind of museum background, really was interesting for me to transition then into sort of my role right now, which I think is a lot more community focused, working with students. And I just really love using art and curating and bringing in artists as a vehicle really for connecting students as well as the public at large with art quite directly and sort of teaching through art, since I'm not talented enough to make art myself. So yeah, that's pretty much what I do.
Perfect. Thank you. ArJae?
Greetings, everyone. My name is ArJae Thompson. I'm a visual artist, one of the members of Norf Art Collective. We're based out in Nashville. A lot of our work is, murals focused on social issues and things like that that relate to the ills of our community. Sort of my origin story, I feel like, is around the same as any other creative. Kind of got inspired by, seeing art in certain places and kind of noticing the importance and what that does as far as like your subconscious and your perception on things, how a certain image can jar a certain action or jar a certain conversation that would not normally happen if you had it like dictated to you. So I guess why I do what I do is kind of knowing that importance, knowing that if you're responsible with the type of imagery that you're making, if it is trying to move towards a goal that, of bridging these gaps and these deficits that we see all over the world, if we create imagery that is pushing us towards that goal, I feel that that is our service as creatives, and that's there's no higher calling than that, I feel. So I think I hit everything. Okay, cool. All right, cool.
Perfect. Thank you, panel. So to start, like I said, we're hoping to explore some pretty deep stuff here today. And what's really interesting is that we are having this conversation in this space. I'm sure some of you know the history of the Crosstown Concourse as the old Sears building, which has been in this community for a long time. I used to see this building every day on my bus ride to school. We rode past this building. And it used to be a very disinvested place. And now when you look at it, it's vibrant and it's full of art. It's full of public art. And so we'll begin our conversation, especially now, at the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, and how that plays into things. We'll begin our conversation with talking about public art. So for the panel, what is the purpose, in your opinion, of public art? Who is it for, and what is public art supposed to do? And we'll start with ArJae.
Public art is for the people. It's for the community that you are seeking to, put your vision upon. So I feel that purpose, number one, it needs to be in line with what is already existing there. A good point that was made yesterday is that people talk about like place making, and it's like, no, it's place keeping. Like the place is already there. You're not fabricating something. You have to add to it. And are we adding to this in a beneficial way rather than something that is contrary to what's there and the people that have been there? So I think the importance of public art, it needs to. I'm sorry, I'm a little jittery from the coffee right now, so excuse me. But the importance of it. It has to be, we'll repeat this again, it has to be socially responsible. Yeah, I'll keep it at that. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Patty?
Yeah. I guess for me, when I think about public art, I know it's such a contentious issue, and we'll probably get into some of those issues here. And I think, it really depends on the community and also the makers and the organizations backing these projects. In terms of, thinking about public art, I think it really just depends on that rather complex nexus of different players and the communities in which they're serving. It's really hard to sort of give a definitive answer of what public art is because it takes so many different forms. Obviously murals, public art commissions, but there are less sort of tangible or less permanent projects as well. So it really kind of depends. And I think that's also what's kind of exciting about public art and gives it so much potential, is that it doesn't have a really tight definition. But I agree with ArJae in the sense that, we have to be mindful of those relationships and where people are coming from. And in particular, right, this issue of gentrification. What kind of impact does art have on a community? I think that there are a lot of miscommunications potentially laden in this kind of process. And in terms of, I'm getting into other issues at the moment, but I think that's really important to keep in mind. So I don't think public art has one kind of definition. It can take many different forms, but I do think that it should ideally, in its sort of ideal form, whatever that may be able to serve a community. And again, that takes many different functions. Not all public art takes place in disinvested communities, right? Some of it does. And I think that sort of issues that might be relevant for one community are obviously not relevant in other places. So I think just being sensitive, my background, I also have a background in anthropology, cultural anthropology, but this idea of, being culturally sensitive to a place is incredibly important. And I do think that's the responsibility of artists, but almost more importantly, perhaps the organizations that are backing projects. I think it really starts there. And I think it involves active participation on all of these different constituents. Yeah.
Actually, you just jump-started the next part of the conversation. It's cool. I want to talk about it, so let's get into it. So in 2013, English artist Grayson Perry very famously said that artists are like the shock troops of gentrification. So there's an idea that gentrification, the takeover of disinvested neighborhoods, begins, in a sense, with artists. Do you all agree with that? Do you disagree with that position? Patty, we'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting quote, and I love Grayson Perry's work. And I think, he's an example of somebody who came up in, really poor working class British family and has skyrocketed to being this sort of international art figure. And makes really beautiful work. But I really, I appreciate when artists like that are aware of their sort of journey and background and are aware of the kind of impact statements like that have. He's obviously speaking from this high position at this point. So I appreciate that he hasn't sort of forgotten about that aspect of his own kind of personal history. But yeah, I think to some extent I agree with what he's saying. I think he's talking about the idea that artists go into communities and, through no fault of their own, are seeking, affordable housing, studio spaces, things of this nature, and then have an impact on that community in terms of kind of elevating its social kind of cultural capital. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of the role that art and artists play and the kind of perception that it has. I think that for the communities that they're entering, sometimes this work might seem, cultured, and what kind of social capital and cultural cachet does that term have, to have an artist moving into your community. I think what maybe the misunderstanding from the community would be that, these artists are somehow different than them, maybe better off socioeconomically. And, sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes artists might be in many ways struggling as well. So that might be one kind of misunderstanding between communities and artists who might be coming in from outside of that community. But, I think that kind of snowballing effect that we've seen in other cities like Brooklyn as an example, now Queens in New York as another example. This kind of domino effect of artists coming in, again, elevating the kind of perception of this community, and then developers coming in, and then kind of having that last major impact, kind of sealing, putting the nail on the coffin, right, to what was once formerly a different community, is a very real process. And I think it's an interesting time for me as somebody who, is not from Memphis originally, but to be coming into this community at this time. I really feel like, and Troy, probably you can attest to this, that we're kind of in this pretty critical moment where this process is actively taking place. And it's interesting to think about, right, being in the process of gentrification, that active process, is a really critical time. And I don't think it's too late for us to do something about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Patty. ArJae?
The quote is definitely very interesting, and I can definitely see how there is this trend of, when the artists come into the community, those are like, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse right before the Big Bang kind of thing. But just kind of harkening back, or I'm gonna relate to my personal story and then kind of like do like a bigger, broader thing. But Nashville is not my place of origin. And when I transferred to Fisk University, it's in a predominantly black neighborhood, rapidly being gentrified. So of course, housing and things like that is a huge issue. And I knew I wanted to work as an artist. And understanding that, I'm 4 years in, I'm glad that I've been adopted into the Nashville family, North Nashville family. I'm a big proponent on, that responsibility of the craft to the community as well. So a lot of the work that we do as Norf, you have to use your skill, your talent to, reflect what you're experiencing. I could be out here just for myself or something like that. And that's where that perception of, these artists that do move into certain communities, and there's like that weird relationship between like what was there and who's here now kind of thing. So I will agree with you, Patty. Like there's definitely, there's caveats and like nuances within certain situations. But I think if we're all on the same wavelength, as far as being transplants or like new adoptees, like, keeping that communication there. You're in the community, so engage with it. Like, know what you're getting into and who you are and where's your place within like this whole ecosystem that, that you've decided to nestle in. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank both of y'all. So, ArJae, one big thread in your answers so far has been the social responsibility of artists to be aware of what the effects of their work on their communities. And Patty, you've spoken to the idea that there is a nexus of individuals who are also responsible for what happens in these neighborhoods. And I agree with both of you that artists don't act alone in what happens to disinvested neighborhoods. Usually there's a collaborative effort to change a neighborhood from one thing to another. One other actor in this process are arts organizations, right? Organizations that support artists, arts that administer to artists. So what are these organizations' responsibility to the neighborhoods that may be being gentrified and using the art of artists to maybe spearhead some of those changes in neighborhoods? What are the responsibilities of the organizations that support artists? Do they have responsibilities? And if so, what are they? We'll start with you, ArJae.
They definitely have a responsibility, and you definitely can't go into saying that you want to invest in the neighborhood, but your idea is just, let me just sprinkle a little art on it. And then, like, that's, when you come at it from that angle, like, it's already doomed to fail. And that's just not cool. So once again, I feel like that idea of getting to being invested more than just like, how can we make this cute? How can we make this popping or something like that? But also knowing, having that open dialogue and that communication with, like I said before, with the people who are there. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think public art, going back to your first question about what public art is, has many different functions. And I think when the function is this kind of idea of community uplift or some kind of, socioeconomic impact on, we hear all these terms like blighted communities, disinvested communities, and improving them, making change. If that is the sort of focus and purpose of a certain public art project, I think, it certainly is on sort of these arts organizations, as well as local governments, to really work together. And, it's such a multi-pronged process. It's not, as ArJae's saying, right? You're not going to just put up a mural or paint a house or quote unquote beautify a neighborhood and fix it. I think the fact that some of the biggest failures perhaps of some of these projects is, they don't come with that complex set, that sort of foundation that these projects need kind of in tandem in order for these projects to really achieve what they're doing, right? A mural can't obviously be the sort of fix for a neighborhood, and it might be a patch, right? But it has to come with real policy change and for these communities. And I think, a lot of you are probably, if you're from this area, a lot of it also boils back down to education and what kind of opportunities are available. It kind of starts there at such a young age for many of these communities and the people that live in them. And so I think, it definitely is sort of the responsibility of local governments as well as arts institutions. And I think communicating between these different groups is really, essential. Did I miss part of your question? No. Okay.
You got all of it. Yeah. You got all of it.
And also just knowing that, just one last point, and just also knowing what the community wants. Like, we know what we don't want, and we know what we want. Like, so being mindful of that, and not trying to make any blanket or sweeping, movements. So.
Thank y'all. Those were some great answers. Y'all actually answered like 5 of my other questions in your answers, which is really great. I appreciate that. So can we talk a little bit more about responsibility? And I'm thinking about the responsibility of the people who consume art, right? This is a gathering that speaks to artists and art collectors. So what responsibilities do the people who observe and consume the art in these neighborhoods have? Is there responsibility to resist, or should they just, take whatever artists and arts organizations and governments give them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important for people in communities to act as active participants in this process and as agents in this process. And I think it's also important to, find out, are there artists in these communities? How can we engage people who are actually in this trade and profession in this process? I think building those kinds of linkages are really important for the overall kind of continued success of projects like this, because there is an actual personal connection and a personal investment in this kind of process. Just thinking back historically, right, this idea of going into a place and kind of imprinting whatever agenda you have. I mean, that's colonialism at its root. Yeah, and so I think we need to think about what we're doing as artists and curators and, you know, various people involved in this process. How do we, you know, make this, again, a more nuanced process than that? And I think, you know, acknowledging the fact that people in these communities are people and they're creative as well, and that they can contribute to this process makes the most sense to me in terms of finding out, again, what is the point of what we're doing here? You know, how is this going to help your community? And what does that look like? And I think tailoring these projects to these communities is really essential. And, you know, again, it might not take the form of a mural or something more permanent. It could be, you know, workshops or more kind of ephemeral projects that might make a greater impact. And I think that those are the kinds of, you know, ultimately, if again, that's the goal of these projects, that's something that needs to be considered.
Thank you. ArJae?
I definitely agree with you there. And the idea of pulling from, you know, the talented people that actually are there. I don't mind with the development of Nashville and how it's growing and stuff like that, that you have artists that don't necessarily live there, but they're like guest artists and they're putting up these really dope murals and stuff like that. That's cool. There also needs to be that balance of the folks that are there, make sure they're paid. And, you know, who better else to have, you know, commissioned for work than the person who, like, lives, you're on the ground, like, you're there. Like, so I feel like that connection is a lot more organic and, like, symbiotic to, like, the forward-moving process of wherever these developments are going to. I feel very ambivalent on, like, how gentrification happens and, like, what battles are lost in those processes, where the wins are. But I know as far as the work that Norf does, we're in a predominantly Black neighborhood, like, and I love being able to see reflections of my community and myself, you know, building, like, that's very important, especially, you know, if you're going past, like, certain landmarks, like, oh, that's that mural, or that's that, you know, that finds its way to the back of your psyche. And like I said before, that springboards inspiration, that springboards a lot of thought that might not have been had before. So I think that when I think that I've run out of words, so I'm gonna put that back on.
Yeah, thank you. So I got a bit of a doozy for y'all next. And this is a question. So often we have these conversations, we talk in very general ways about how we can stop gentrification and how we can support artists. But very specifically, because gentrification happens primarily because the rich and powerful and their interests center on a place and they want that place for themselves. So how can we as artists, as collectors, as residents of communities, how can we stop the elite and powerful from obstructing and silencing artists and residents and communities and organizations? And ArJae, I'll start with you.
Yes. Okay, so I think the biggest form of resistance is knowing your allies. And I'm no politician whatsoever, but I know folks who are on the same wavelength who are making those pushes. Right across the street from me, there's a lot that has already been bought up by a developer, and they're about to put up 300 units, and they have no plan on having any type of affordable housing. And so there's, as an artist, I can visually communicate that, but there are folks who are within policy that are on the same wavelength that will be able to do that type of pushback. And we need to literally work. We got to do the whole Voltron thing and get together on this thing, because like you use the term like multi-pronged attack. We have to know our allies. You know, every member of the Avengers has a very specific power. You know what I'm saying? And they have specialized they have specialized skills. So as far as that is concerned, the specifics of it, like if you know what the public rhetoric is, we already know the nature of the beast. I'm gonna let you get your suit and your tie and go ahead and start being at every one of those like community oversight meetings and like things like that, fighting for, you know, at least 30% of those units be something that is manageable for, you know, people who need a place to live, who want to live there. A lot of my friends from my school, like, they would love to live in North Nashville. Can't afford it. Why is that? I went to school right here, like, and I would like to be engaged on a level that I can't, because now I'm separated by an hour's worth of traffic, or I have to be displaced. But like I said, we have to know our allies, know where our specific strengths lie, and know that those folks that are doing like the paperwork and the showing up to, you know, these meetings that are being had in these clandestine little ways and stuff like that, we got those type of fighters. And then as far as like creatives, we have the fighters who are going to visually communicate, put those markers up there, not have some you know, imagery that is assaulting you, but more so that is moving forward in that collective consciousness in the way that we want to see like our communities. So
Thank you. Great answer. Love the Avengers references. Love the Avengers. Patty?
Yeah, I think that's all spot on. And I think just the power of, our responsibility as citizens and on a local and a federal level. I think it's obvious, but, you know, the power of who we elect, who we support in these positions that do make those decisions. I think, you know, acknowledging the power that we have. Again, we are not politicians, but we are connected to them, and acknowledging that we do have that power is something I think that's quite important. And yeah, just getting to know local arts organizations, getting to know what kind of projects are in this community, how you can be involved with them, how you can support them financially. I know a lot of nonprofits are very much struggling. A lot of collectives are struggling. So as a community member, right, finding those nonprofits that you want to support and throw in all your donations their way, because they really need them to operate. And I know a lot of arts organizations are in that same boat with really limited budgets. And, you know, if you find one that's doing work in your community that you support, you know, back them and show them your support. And it's not just financial, it's, you know, volunteering, you know, helping, you know, serving on boards, helping organize some of these projects. I know that, you know, manpower, human power is incredibly valuable as well.
Thank you, Patty, because you led right into my last question for you all, which is, aside from your organizations, who out here is really doing the work? Who's putting in work to make sure the communities are represented and that justice is being served in these communities through art? Besides your organization, right? Because I think both of you work for organizations that do great work, but who else is out here doing it? And Patty, we'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, just in Memphis specifically, obviously we're in Crosstown, and we're part of, you know, even just hosting this kind of art fair is something that's pretty new and exciting for this community. And the fact that it brought us here as a group together and we're having this conversation, not just about collecting and the sort of investment in art, but also talking about issues like public art in this context, I think is really refreshing. To associate public art in an art fair context is not, typical, especially in this manner. The issues of gentrification is probably, something that a lot of art, a typical art fair might not want to talk about. But I think it's important that this conversation is happening in this context too, because I think the sort of building up an antagonistic kind of relationship and thinking about these worlds as really separate, it isn't very productive and isn't necessarily helpful. And kind of speaking to that, while there are many kind of grassroots organizations, obviously here in Memphis, I know the Collective is a really active local group that does great work. The Urban Art Commission, too, is from what I gather, a fairly long-standing institution, but making new inroads in sort of recent years. But I also, they're grassroots organizations, but then they're also, artists who, are working at a really high level, but then are sort of thinking in this way. And Mel Chin is one example of an artist who actually came to Memphis a few years ago. And he's somebody who, could be living the life, and perhaps he is, but he's also, finding ways to give back to communities. Flint, Michigan is just one example. And, there's an example of somebody who is sort of a complete outsider, but I don't think that these relationships always have to be looked at with skepticism and ill intent. I think that there are people out there who are using their platform of success and fame for good causes. And so there's just some local and very much not local examples.
Thank you, Patty. ArJae, who's doing the work, man?
Well, I know from the historical street that I'm like one street over from, it's damn near like a hidden Mecca in a sense. And so you have like these players that are on like kind of this grassroots level that have been basically champions of the community for like forever. One Drop Ink is a tattoo parlor, Black-owned tattoo parlor. Alicia Israel, she is like, her work in the community is something unparalleled. Thaxton Waters, he's also another local artist that has kind of been one of these like purveyors of, what we desire to see out of our communities, people who are like there. The Jefferson Street Art Crawl is an event that happens at the end of every month, the fourth Saturday of every month, and is local artists that are able to show and to be able to, shed light on something that, on a community that usually is overlooked. Like we have like, a art crawl that happens downtown, but, with gallery works and stuff like that. Sometimes, folks like us don't have the type of exposure there. But these are entities that have really understood and have a vested interest in the neighborhood that they're in. And there's programming that happens at the Magruder Family Resource Center that is very much engaged in our neighborhood. And there's entities, there's folks out there that are doing the work as well, and like that it's cool to have that army like with you, like you're not just out there by yourself and fighting like this monster by yourself. So I know I'm probably like missing other folks. I apologize for that, but yeah, that's sort of it. Yeah.
Thanks, man. Thank both of you for engaging with these questions and answering them really truthfully. We could go on. I have a whole list. I got like maybe 10 more questions on my list. I'm not going to put y'all through that. I know the audience has some questions. So for now, we'll start taking questions from the audience.